In this video, we are going to build an animated list with Framer Motion and Tailwind CSS. Here is a quick demo of what we're going to build. We have a list of email items that is currently blank, but when I click on the Add button, you can see we have a message that nicely animates in. You can add some more. You can see the list continues to populate and becomes a scroll view once we have enough items. And then if we select some of these items, we can archive them. You can see the list nicely animates as items are removed all the way down to no items. To get started, go ahead and download the starter code using the link in the description down below. Make sure to run npm install to get all the dependencies. And with that, let's jump in. Here we have the starter code for this project. It's just a blank one-page website using Next.js and Tailwind, you see on the left, and just has some placeholder text. And we will primarily be working in the index file in the pages directory, which you can see is quite bare right now. And the other file I will just call out here in the starter code is this utility file for message generator. This will handle for us the process of generating dummy content automatically. So we don't have to worry about this in this tutorial. But just to quickly walk through it, I've just set up a predefined list of content where we have pairs of effectively titles and subtitles, sort of referencing email content in a way. I have defined this interface called message data, which just has some ID and then one of these content arrays. And then finally, there's this generate message function, which we'll be using for the most part, which just randomly generates a UUID and then randomly selects one of these pieces of content and then returns it. So with that, let's start by building out the content and structure of this email list that we're going to build. So in the index file, just have this main tag right now. So let's replace the content. I'm going to throw a div in here, and then all of the actual fun stuff with this email list, we're going to actually put it in its own component, and we can just do it in this file, honestly. So I'll just make the component really quickly. We'll call it email component. And for now, we'll just have it return a div that just says email component, and then we'll pull this up here. So now it says email component. Let's do some quick styling on the overall page. So on this main tag, we will use flexbox, item center, justify center. So just centering all the content. I will set a minimum height of screen. So we'll fill up the whole vertical space of the screen, and a background of zinc 300. Let's save that. You can see the content gets centered, and we get this light gray background that fills up the whole screen. Then inside this div, I'm going to define a height, and I'm just going to manually set this to 400 pixels with the full in a max width of large. So this helps define the size, the bounding size of the email component. So now let's move to building out the content and structure of the email component. So in the surrounding div, I'm going to apply a couple styles. So I'm going to give it a background of white, and I'm going to round the corners as well. I hit save. You can see right now the size of email component is being defined just right now by this text, so not very large. Now within this email component parent div, we're going to throw two divs underneath it. The first div is going to be for the top toolbar, which will include the two primary buttons for adding and archiving messages. In this div, we're going to just add right now a couple of buttons. First one will be add, and then a second button that says archive. We'll go style this in a second. And then in the second div will be where our list of messages live. So there'll be an unordered list, and there'll be a series of list items in this unordered list. And for now, let's just throw some content in here so we can see it. What I'm going to do is actually wrap everything inside the list item in a button. And that's because we're going to want to be able to select these list items to archive them later on. And inside this button, there'll be two pieces of text. Let's just say title in the paragraph tag and subtitle. I'll actually switch just to be a span. And now that is going to be one of our pieces of content. So now let's go ahead and start styling some of this to make it look better than what we have right now. So returning up to the toolbar at the top first. So this first div here. Let's first style the div. So we're going to apply flexbox and justify between, which will space out these two buttons. I'll explicitly give it a width of full as well. Give it a border bottom of zinc 100, and I'll also give that border bottom a width of 1 pixel, and I also will apply finally a padding of 4. And so you can see the padding came in, so it's already starting to look a little bit better, and then just added this very light divider line to separate out this kind of top toolbar section from the actual content below. All right, let's go to these buttons. We just need to style one of these, and then we can copy the styling. So for this button, I'm going to update the font color to a gray. I'm going to apply some padding. On hover, I want to darken the text slightly. And now if I just copy the styling to the other button we have as well, there we go. The one thing I will quickly do is you'll actually notice it's more visible actually on this right one. Because we added this padding of X of 2, it shifts the content towards the middle. So the add button gets shifted to the right, the archive button gets shifted to the left a little bit. What we actually want is the actual text of, let's say, this add button to line up with the rest of our content below. And so what I'm just going to do is I'm going to throw in a negative margin just to shift it back to the left manually. So for that, we'll have to say -mx2 to do a negative margin. If I hit save, you can see it shifts the add button a little bit back. And let me do the same as well for archive. And for archive, you can see it shifted it back to the right a little bit. All right, so that is the top toolbar with the buttons. Now let's move to styling the actual content below of the email list. So on this surrounding parent div, I'm going to first apply a max height of 400 pixels, which matches the height that we had set up above for the surrounding parent div around this email component. Going to apply some padding, horizontal padding and vertical padding. And then finally, I'm going to also apply an overflow Y scroll. So this will enable this list to keep going. And so even though our whole div will max out at 400 pixels, we can scroll up and down to see the full list. So that's the div. The unordered lists we're going to leave. We don't need to add any explicit styling to that. So let's scroll down to the list items. And I'm actually going to quickly surround this all in another div, and later on we'll see why we're doing that, because we're going to eventually abstract out this list item into a separate component. So in this div, I'm going to apply a surrounding padding 0.5, and I'm also going to add right now this transition property, which will turn on CSS transitions for everything in this div. Now in this button, let's add some styling here. And again, this is just so that we can select each item later on. So on this button, I'm going to apply flex box, flex column to lay out the text content vertically with the full padding of 4. I'm going to round it a little bit as well. I'm going to apply transition colors again here because we're going to move and transition colors in a little bit. Hit save. You can see the padding was added, and you can see now the content as well as lined up because of Flexbox. Now for the paragraph tag, I'm going to set font medium to make it a little bit thicker. Also add transition colors here. And then for the span, I'm going to say text of small and transition colors here as well. So now we've kind of nicely, I think, laid out what this content can look like. So with everything now laid out, let's move to making this dynamic. Let's get some actual data going and actually start to be able to add and archive these list items. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up the data structure. So inside the email component, I'm going to add a couple of state properties. One will be called messages, and I'll use state. And this use state, because we're using TypeScript here, we're going to apply types as we can. So we know that this messages will be an array of the message data interface that we had defined earlier. So we'll say use state is going to take that type of an array of message data. And by default, it'll just be an empty array. I'm going to add a second state property called selected messages as well. This one will just be an array of strings. In this case, an array of the IDs of the messages that are selected at any given point. So we're just going to store the actual strings instead of the whole message data. So we have those set up. Now let's do something with these properties. So the first function I'm going to create is the ability to add a message. So I'm going to have a function here called add message. And here we're going to first generate a new message. And here's where we will use the helper utility file that we went through earlier. So I'm going to pull in generate message from that file. So this will return for us a generated message of type message data. So then all we need to do is to call set messages, take the previous value, and return the previous value and just add new message and append it to that. Let's quickly attach add message to the button that will use it. So this button here, I will add a on click and add message. So now this button is hooked up. If we click it, nothing's going to happen. Well, nothing visible is going to happen. And that's because we haven't actually tied our list to this messages array. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's scroll down. So underneath this unordered list, going to open up curly braces to add some JavaScript in line. And here I'm just going to take the messages array. I'm going to reverse it so that the item that was added last will be now the first one that gets displayed. I'm going to map this array where each value will be called message. And now inside of this, we're going to return this list item. So I'm just going to cut and paste it up here. And so you can see now, when I hit save, you can see that we have now 5 items. And that's because, well, I'd hit the add button 5 times before. If I refresh the page, it'll reset itself to empty out the state. Starts with no items. If I hit add, you can see you start to add items. It gets bigger and bigger. And at some point, it maxes out the height. But if we scroll, we can see the rest of the items added. All of them start now just say title and subtitle. So let's change that. So let's replace the content for first the p tag. And here we'll just take message.content, the first value in content. Remember, content is just an array of 2 values with the title and the subtitle. And then for the span, the same thing, but content will take the second value. So if I hit save, now we can start to see our dynamic content being pulled in. So now we can add new messages. Let's figure out how to archive these. So there's 2 things that we need to do. The first is we need to be able to select items and multiple items if we want before we hit the archive button. So let's start there. So first let's set up the helper function that will help with that. So I'm going to make this function called toggle message. This will take a string value of ID, which will tell us which message do we want to toggle the state of, whether it's selected or unselected. So then here I'm going to say if selected messages, which is where we're going to store all the messages that are selected at any given point, if it includes the ID value that was passed, then we want to unselect that message. So I'm going to say set selected messages, take the previous value of the state, and return the previous value with filtering out this ID. So again, if when we hit, let's say, one of these and we want to toggle it, if selected messages already includes the ID, that means it's currently selected. So we want to unselect. And the way we unselect is we're going to kind of set selected messages to the same array, but with filtering out this specific ID. So we're filtering out and only going to keep items where it's not equal to pass an ID. Now, if that's not the case, that means it's not selected. And so we want to select it. So we need to set selected messages to take the previous value and return the previous value with this ID appended. So now we can toggle messages. Let's now visually set that up so we can see messages being toggled. So if I scroll down, let's go to the list items and this button. And on this button, let's add an on click. And we're just going to simply call toggle message, and we're going to pass in the message.id. Now, if I go here and I click any of these, well, our function is actually being called, but we can't visually see it in any way. So let's update some of the styling here to visually see if a message is selected or not. Let's go into the same button, and I'm going to change this class name to be dynamic. So I'm going to put it in curly braces, surround with backticks, and then at the end, I'm going to check. something. So I'm going to check if selected messages includes our message ID by ID. Then, using the ternary operator, if it's selected, let's set the background to be blue, else the background can be white. Now, if I hit save, you can already see our first two items, which we had clicked before, are now blue. So that means that they are selected. And if I click them again, they change back to white. That means they're being unselected. And you can see there's a nice fade transition between the background colors changing, and that's because of this transition colors property that we had added earlier to the button. Let's go ahead and also transition the color of the text, because against this blue background, it gets a little bit tricky to start seeing it. So let's change it to maybe a white color. If we go into the p tag, I'm also going to make this class name dynamic, curly braces, and backticks. And then I'm going to add if selected messages includes message ID. Then let's set the text to be white. So when it's selected in this blue background state, let's make the text white. Else, let's actually make the text a zinc 600 instead of pure black. You can see that text changed color. Now let's just do it on the span as well. Curly braces, backticks. And I'm actually just going to copy this check. And instead of these colors, I'm just going to change it a little bit. So when it's selected, I'm going to make this zinc 100. And then when it's not selected, make it zinc 400. And so that adds a little bit of visual hierarchy as well to content. All right, so now we can select and unselect items. And now I can go here. If I select and unselect, you can see the text color also transitions nicely because we had transition colors as well here. And actually, there's a typo here. Okay, now that transition looks better. So now all the colors are being transitioned. So we can select items. Now let's actually be able to archive them. So I'll scroll back up, can make another helper function here called archive messages. This one will be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to say first set messages. And I'm going to take the previous value and I'm going to filter and only keep items where selected messages does not include the message ID. And just go to add return statement here. The error goes away. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to clear out selected messages. So I'm going to set selected messages to be empty. So now with that, let's finally just attach it to the button. So we have a way to call the function. So on click, archive messages. Hit save. We already have some items selected. Now if I hit archive, they go away. A couple other ones, they go away. If I select all of them and hit archive, they all disappear. So now we have the ability to both add and archive items from our list. I'm going to add one other element here to our list, which is if there are no items in the list. Right now, it's just blank. There's nothing really interesting going on. If this was a real application, a user might wonder if something's gone wrong maybe, and that's why it looks like this. So let's add just some visual cues that there are no messages. So in this unordered list, before we map through the messages array, I'm going to add another JavaScript block and just first check and see if messages length is equal to 0. So if there's no messages, and I'm just going to use this shorthand to say if this is true and then put some JSX in here. So this means if messages.length is 0, then we're going to return the stuff that's below here. And so what I'm going to add here is simply a list item. I'll do an H1 and I'll just say you have no messages. Now I'll add just a little bit of styling to this H1, text center, font semi-bold, and a little bit of vertical padding. So now if I add message, that you have no messages text goes away and you actually have your list. You can keep adding. If I archive some of these, still just a list. If I archive all of them, I get back that you have no messages. So the final thing now that we have to do is to add some animations to the list as things get added, as things get archived, to make it just feel a little bit more fluid and sophisticated. So for that, what I'm going to do is first make the list items have some animate properties from Framer Motion that will help dictate how should they animate in when they get added and how should they animate out when they get removed. And because there's going to be a few things we add there, I'm just going to throw all of this into a separate surrounding component. For that, I'm going to make a new folder. Let's call it components. And here I'm just going to make a new file, call it AnimatedListItem. Make a new component here, and now let's start building it out here. Just to start with, I'm going to first do a quick interface, call it AnimatedListItem props. And what I want this to do is I just want this to be surrounding our actual content that we want to include. And so the one property I just need to explicitly call out is the children property, which will be of type React node. And I just need to import from React. Then this AnimatedListItem component will be explicitly of type React functional component, which takes the props that we defined above. Now we can just destructure the props directly. And then what I want to do is return a list item component and then just pass the children in here. So right now, this is not really doing anything interesting, but let's quickly go back to our index file and swap out all of these list item tags for the animated list item component. So I'm just going to do that, animated list item, and let's update the ending tag as well. I'm just also going to do it as well for this do have no messages as well, so that we get that to animate as well. So hit save. If I add stuff, nothing has changed at all, which is good. We didn't expect anything to change. But now this allows us to start adding some animations to this component that will feed through to all of the items here. So let's go back to the animated list item component. The first thing I'm going to do is make this a motion li, which will be how we enable framer motion. Let me import it. So this will now tell framer motion, hey, this is a framer motion component. Take a look and see what we're defining here. Inside, I'm going to start defining some of the framer motion properties. First, I'm going to apply just a class name of relative, which will just help with some of the animations. I'm going to apply an initial, which will be what state do we want this component to be in pre-animation as a starting point. So I'm going to set two things here. I'm going to say the height will be 0 and opacity will be 0. And then let's also add for now the animate property. So when this gets added to the DOM, initially what we want the state to be, and then what state do we want it to animate to. So that's what these two properties are doing. So for animate, I'll say height will be auto. So this will just say, what should the height be based on the content it includes? Opacity should be 1. And then let's also add a transition property. So in this transition property, I'm going to first set a type of spring. So we're going to have a spring animation. Because it's a spring animation, we can define a bounce value, which is kind of the springiness of the spring, so to speak. So we set that value to 0.3. And for opacity, I'm going to apply a delay of 0.1. So just a small little delay. So let me hit save. And before we move forward, I'm just going to also quickly define a very quick helper function to help manage some of these delay values. So just here, I'm going to define a variable called base and set it to 4. And then a quick helper function that takes a number and just returns the number times the base. So this will help kind of, as we define these different delay values specifically, will help make sure they're kind of choreographed and spaced out in a nice way. So instead of 0.1, I will, for example, just say t of 0.025. Now in reality, that just becomes 0.025 times 4, which is the 0.1 that's earlier. Okay, so we have an initial and animate value. So now if I hit save, and if I start adding, look at that. We actually start to see the animations come in. You can see how they come in here. And it's a little bit janky right now. It's not exactly how we want it, but you can start to see the elements of it coming through. You can see the bounce, like here, right? When I add, you can see it bounce at the end. So it come a little bit further down and then bounce back up. And you can see the heights changing, and you can see the opacity also that's fading in. So why are our animations looking a little bit janky right now? It seems like it's not really working all the way through. Well, it actually comes down to a very simple thing that we need to add to each of these animated list items, which is an ID or a unique key value. So here I'm just going to do a key, and I'm just going to set the key to be equal to the message ID. Now, why is this important? And you can see actually quickly before you jump in, if I now add, you can see that it's actually behaving now much nicer, and you can truly see the fade in and the height coming in and things nicely shifting down. Well, that's because when we tell Framer Motion to do all these animations, it needs to keep track of not just the animation of, let's say, this new component that you're adding in, this new emote list, but also needs to figure out how all the other visual components and elements of the DOM need to shift around to accommodate this new component as it animates in. But in order to track everything properly, it needs to have some sort of strong reference to each of the components to appropriately move them around. And so that's why before we didn't have this key. So it didn't have a strong reference to each of these other components and therefore wasn't able to animate things correctly. But now when we make sure that each of the components has a key it can track uniquely, it's able to appropriately track everything and animate things as we expect. So it's actually a really small detail, but really important to have keys set to enable this. So we're now animating things in. What about animating things out? Well, let's try it. Okay, well, I just tried archiving and nothing's really happening. So the first thing we should try to add is an exit property. We have defined initial and animate, but now let's add an exit property. And on exit, let's say we want the height to be 0 and opacity to be 0, right? So the exit state it should animate to when this element or component is removed from the DOM is height of 0, opacity of 0. So it should fade out and then collapse vertically. And then let's finally add a transition property, which will help define the transition between the animate state to the exit state. Over duration, we'll use our helper function to define the duration. We'll have this type also be spring to be consistent. In this case, we'll set the bounce to be 0, so we actually don't want to bounce at the end. And for the opacity, we'll add a duration of, again, using the helper function. Okay, so we define the exit state and also how we want to transition to that, so it should work. So let's go ahead here. We add some more values. I select some of them and I archive them. Okay, well, that didn't work. Well, why is that? Well, there's one key other piece that we need to add, which is if we go back to index, we need to add a animate presence tag that surrounds this entire list. And so let's do that really quickly. Animate presence from Framer Motion. Let's surround everything with this. Now, what animate presence tells Framer Motion is, okay, Framer Motion, for all elements, components that are underneath animate presence, please watch for not just elements entering the DOM, which by default it always will watch to animate things correctly, but also please keep an eye out for components leaving the DOM and appropriately animate those as well. So by default, Framer Motion is not going to track things disappearing from the DOM and animate them, even if we define the appropriate properties. We need to explicitly tell it through just animate presence. I'm also just going to add a initial false. So this is more of a small thing so that it doesn't always on the initial load. It doesn't apply the initial animations that we had set. So by default, there's no animation when you reload the page. So now let's try it. So I've added animate presence. If I select some of these items and hit archive, look at that. There's the animation that we were hoping for. It nicely fades away, moves up. And if we actually archive everything, something nice that we get is this you have no messages item also is animated in nicely because we're surrounding it as well in this animated list item tag. And so it gets all the animations as well for free. So with that, we have finished building this simple animated list. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments below. Also, if there are any other topics you want to see covered on the channel, let me know in the comments. And on screen now, you'll find a link to another great tutorial for you to check out next, and I'll see you in the next video.